Concept 31.4 talks about basically the five major groups of fungi. Fungi have radiated into a diverse set of lineages, and again on page 642 of your textbook you can take a look at a picture, and it says molecular analysis have helped clarify evolutionary relationships among fungal groups, although areas of uncertainty still remain. So if we take a look on the textbook chapter page 6, chapter 30, is this chapter 30? Yep, chapter 31, I'm sorry, page 642. We'll see something similar to the layout that we see here. So you have the chytrids and the zygomycetes, which you see kind of the double lines because scientists tend to believe that these two groups are paraphyletic. In other words, they don't kind of share the same common ancestor. They may be subdivided into groups that contain other ancestors, so we haven't quite sorted all that out yet. But these are the five major groups of fungi that we're going to take a look at: the chytrids, the zygomycetes, the glomeromycetes, the ascomycetes, and the basidiomycetes. And we'll take a look probably at some common examples of each one of these, if there are common examples, and we'll just talk briefly about each one. The chytrids are the first up. They're found in freshwater and terrestrial habitats. They can be decomposers, parasites, or mutualists. Molecular evidence supports the hypothesis that chytrids diverged early in fungal evolution, so these would be perhaps the most ancient form of fungal life. Chytrids are unique among fungi in having flagellated spores called zoospores. So in this case, the spores of the fungi actually look more like, say, a mammalian sperm cell. They have a flagella to help move them around, and this would be the only fungi that have spores that are flagellated like this. So if we were looking at all of the fungi, the chytrids would be probably most closely related to the common ancestor of all the fungi. So this chytrid is where we're looking at now. This is what a little chytrid zoospore looks like through a transmission electron microscope, and you can see its little flagellum right there. And then I think we have a couple of videos. If you look in the notes folder for this chapter, I believe there are some zoospore videos, just short little videos that you can take a look at. The next group is the zygomycetes. The zygomycetes exhibit great diversity of life histories. There are many different ways of reproducing and different sort of life cycles amongst this group of zygomycetes. They include fast-growing molds, parasites, and commensal symbionts, which would be creatures that have these symbiotic relationships with other living creatures. The life cycle of black bread mold is a fairly typical example of the phylum. Its hyphae are cenocytic, which means they do not have the septate, they don't have the divisions between the cells, so basically you have just one large cell with many nuclei, and asexual sporangia reproduce or produce haploid spores. So the zygomycetes are the next in line here of the fungi we're taking a look at. And again, I wouldn't have you necessarily recall every single bit of the reproductive cycle, but there are a couple of things I want to point out about the zygomycetes. In the zygomycetes life cycle, perhaps the bread mold would be our best example, a common example that you might see. They can reproduce asexually, so they can reproduce just creating asexual sporangia that will reproduce spores and allow spores to be released, or they do have a way of reproducing sexually as well, to where you would have two different mating types. Here they're called a negative and a positive. They can join together in plasmogamy, and then at some point you'll have the nuclei fuse. That would be karyogamy. Sometimes within that diploid nuclei you have the formation of this this thing here. It's called a zygosporangium. This zygosporangium is kind of a way of getting through tough times. So think about it as a diploid nuclei surrounded by a hard shell, and that zygosporangium can then, if the conditions are not right, if there's no food or no water, it can kind of go into a dormancy and survive for some time until conditions are correct again, and then it undergoes meiosis, and then we have sporangium that will release again haploid spores and start the whole process over again. So they can reproduce asexually or sexually like a lot of the fungi can. The name zygomycetes come from this thing that we were talking about right here, this zygosporangium that we were just mentioning. The zygosporangia are the site of karyogamy and then meiosis. Zygosporangia, which are resistant to freezing and drying, can survive unfavorable conditions. And there's one interesting zygomycete to mention. Bread mold is a good example, but there's another type called a pilobolus, a pilobolus. that actually grows in manure like cow manure or horse manure, and this zygomycete can actually aim its sporangia toward conditions associated with good food sources. So here's a good example. You can even go online and find video of this. This pilobolus or pilobolus, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, it has this fruiting body that rises up, and then it has the sporangia on top, and then it will actually turn or kind of face light, and it will shoot that sporangia toward a lit area. In other words, it's attempting to find kind of an open area to reach fresh grass, a fresh plot of land, because what happens is animals will then eat that grass with the sporangia on the grass, and it will go through their digestive system and be pooped out the other end, and that will continue the life cycle of this particular fungi, the zygomycete. This particular one is pilobolus or pilobolus. The third of the 5 categories of fungi we're going to take a look at are called the glomeromycetes. The glomeromycetes were once considered zygomycetes, but they've now been kind of separated out, put in their own clade. Glomeromycetes form arbuscular mycorrhiza, and these are 2 words that we now should be familiar with. We should now know. Arbuscular means that they extend hyphae into the cell wall or into the cells of, say, the plant that they have a relationship, or they form these indentations into the cell wall and cell membrane, and their hyphae actually go into the cell itself. If you'll remember, those type of hyphae that actually extend into the cell have a special name called haustorium. So arbuscular means they have these haustorium or haustoria that extend into the cell of their particular host. And when we say mycorrhiza, what we mean is they have this relationship, usually a mutualistic relationship with some other form of plant. So arbuscular mycorrhiza would tell you exactly how they behave, and that they have this relationship with another plant where they provide nutritional uptake for the plant because of the mycelium, the surface area of the hyphae, and then in turn the plant provides basically a source of food like glucose, and they both kind of work together for water uptake and the like. So if we were going to look at the 5 groups again, we've looked at the chytrids that have the flagellated spores, the zygomycetes like the bread molds, and now glomeromycetes, which are mycorrhizal type fungi or arbuscular mycorrhiza. Next we're going to take a look at the ascomycetes, but I think we have a picture here. Here's a good example of an arbuscular mycorrhiza. This is, if you can kind of make it out, this will be the cell wall of the plant cell, and then this is the hyphae that has extended into the inside of the cell. Fourth on our list of fungi is the ascomycetes. The ascomycetes you might be familiar with because some of these we actually eat. They live in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial habitats. Ascomycetes produce sexual spores in sac-like asci containing fruiting bodies called ascocarps. That's where we get the name. Ascomycetes are commonly called sac fungi. Ascomycetes vary in size and complexity from unicellular yeast, so they can be as small as a unicellular yeast, to elaborate cup fungi and morels, which is a commonly served edible fungi. So you might be familiar with a morel, which is a type of fungi that is served on human plates sometimes. So we have the chytrids, the zygomycetes, the glomeromycetes, the ascomycetes, and that's what we're looking at now, the ascomycetes. So here's a good example of a morel, which is obviously a multicellular large structure here. And another good example of a ascomycete is a truffle. Truffles grow underground, but they form these parts to them that can be hunted and dug up and used in various food dishes. Many times they are somewhat rare and they're somewhat sought after, so they can be quite expensive. And these truffles, actually many of them give off a particular odor. Remember, we were talking about the pheromones that some of the fungi give off. They give off an odor that's somewhat similar to the pheromones of a male pig. So they'll actually use female pigs to kind of hunt and search for these truffles. And a lot of people have trained female pigs whose job it is to kind of root around in the ground and search out for these truffles. Oftentimes some people even farm these truffles where they plant the kind of tree that the truffle has a good mycorrhizal association with, and then some of them are quite expensive on the market for various dishes and food related items. So there's a wide variety of ascomycetes. Some of them include plant pathogens, decomposers, symbionts. Ascomycetes reproduce asexually by enormous numbers of asexual spores called conidia. Conidia are not formed inside the sporangia. They're actually produced asexually at the tips of specialized hyphae called conidiospores. So unlike most of, or some of the other fungi that we're going to take a look at that have a specialized area, a sporangia, where it produces the spores, these spores are actually created at the tips of special hyphae. So that makes them a little unique, a little bit different. A good example is a type of bread mold. It's a well-studied organism. It has a well-studied genome for the ascomycetes. Again, I wouldn't ask you to remember every single detail, but the ascomycetes, much like many of the other fungi, can reproduce asexually or sexually. And so the main difference here is instead of having sporangia that produce the spores, their spores are produced at the ends of specialized hyphae that you can see right here. So these are the ascospores produced at the ends of the hyphae, and these are conidiospore, which would be kind of like the specialized hyphae where the spores are produced. So they can go through plasmogamy, karyogamy, kind of the same thing that we've looked at already, or they can reproduce asexually, but the main difference is their spores are not produced in sporangia, but at the ends of these specialized hyphae that you see here. The last group of fungi we're going to take a look at are the basidiomycetes. The basidiomycetes include mushrooms. That's probably what most people think of when they think of fungi. They also include puffballs, which you've probably seen before, those big round shaped kind of mushroom things that when you step on them there's a plume of like powder that comes out. Those are actually spores. And shelf fungi, mycorrhiza, and different kinds of plant parasites. The phylum is defined by club-like structure called basidium, which is a transient diploid stage in the life cycle. So these basidiomycetes are also called club fungi, and many basidiomycetes are decomposers of wood. So if you go out to a forest or you go walking along a trail, you're likely to see many of these. These are probably what you think of when you think of the word mushroom. So these are the 5 that we looked at: the chytrids, the zygomycetes, glomeromycetes, ascomycetes, and now we're looking at the basidiomycetes, probably the ones that most people know when they think mushroom or fungi. Here's some good examples. Shelf fungi, very common on rotting wood. If you do any walking or hiking or camping, you've probably seen different variety of shelf fungi here in East Texas and Central Texas. Puffballs, you've probably seen these, particularly when they begin to dry out. When they're not quite dried out, they're kind of spongy. After they've dried out and start to split open, if you run over them with a lawnmower or step on them, you'll get this plume of powder, which is actually millions of tiny spores spreading everywhere. And then here's another interesting one called a maiden veil fungus, just a different type of mushroom with a different bell top that you don't often see. The life cycle of basidiomycetes usually includes a long-lived dikaryotic mycelium. Remember, dikaryotic means that there are cells that have 2 separate haploid nuclei from 2 different parental types, but they haven't fused together yet. So a long-lived dikaryotic mycelium. In response to environmental stimuli, this mycelium, which primarily lives either underground or within the rotting wood that it's eating on, this can reproduce sexually by producing elaborate fruiting bodies called basidiocarps. Mushrooms are a good example of basidiocarps. So the mushrooms that you see when you walk through the forest, those are the reproductive structures of these basidiomycetes called basidiocarps. The numerous basidia in a basidiocarp are sources of sexual spores called basidiospores. If you ever looked on the underside of a mushroom cap, you'll see hundreds of like little fins, are called gills. Inside those gills are hundreds of these basidia. These basidia are producing these basidiospores that are then released. So again, one more time, these guys can reproduce in a couple of different ways. So we can go through the whole process of the spores can grow mycelia of, say, a negative and a positive mating type. They can undergo plasmogamy where they join together. They usually spend the majority of their life in this stage, the dikaryotic mycelium, and then they will produce these basidiocarps. Inside these basidiocarps, you'll see these like gill-like structures lined with what's called basidia. These basidia undergo karyogamy, and then through meiosis they produce spores. So for a brief period in the basidia you have diploid state, the diploid nuclei, but then they undergo meiosis and then they produce haploid spores, and there'll be these little bodies called basidium, and on the ends will be hanging these little basidiospores, and you would have to have a microscope or a very strong magnifying glass to see these structures. When you look underneath the mushroom you're really only going to see the gills, but if you were to examine them very closely you would see these basidium structures, and then those spores can be released and start the whole cycle all over again. Here's a nice close-up shot of the underside of that mushroom showing these basidiospores. Basidiomycetes are normally within the soil or within the rotting wood. They're stretching their mycelium all over the place. They may cover many square feet, and you would never know it because they're under your feet, underneath the ground. But when conditions are right, they can quickly produce mushrooms for reproductive purposes. So say in the springtime when it's starting to get warm in the spring, and after a nice rainstorm you may suddenly wake up and suddenly in your yard you have mushrooms where they weren't there the day before. Or you come home from school and there's mushrooms in the yard where there were no mushrooms when you left that day. So they can do this fairly quickly. Some species produce what's called a fairy ring, which is a grouping of these mushrooms or reproductive structures all around the outer edge of the mycelium, which remains underground and out of sight. So you may, in a field or in a lawn, you may see an entire ring of mushrooms, and they used to be called, or still called, fairy rings, because supposedly in folklore this is what occurred when fairies came out and danced in the moonlight. This was like their little stage. But actually what's happening is within this entire circle you have mycelium all throughout the ground, and usually on the outer edges, when conditions are right, they will pop up these reproductive stages, these basidiocarps called mushrooms, to release spores. We're going to take a break right there. So that's the 4 different kinds of mushrooms, the 4 different categories, or clades we might call them. They would be the chytrids, the zygomycetes, the glomeromycetes, the ascomycetes, and the mushrooms that you generally think of are called basidiomycetes. We'll take a break. We'll finish up with the importance of fungi in nature and as far as humans are concerned, and we'll round out this chapter.